Okay, hello everybody. Today is Saturday, August the 19th, and today I'm going to be talking about Mars opposite Neptune. But before I get into that, I would just like to remind you that the actual thing going on involves a number of astrological dynamics, and I was trained. I have taken the year one certification course from Adam Ellenboss, although, however, that was way back in 2018, and time has gone on and stuff like that. But one of the things that Adam Ellenboss, I remember him teaching in that course, was specifically not to use what he called Indiana Jones aspect patterns, or like these big patterns that but this is one of those ones that it's called a kite, because what you do is you combine basically you've got a grand trine happening between all the earth signs, Virgo, Taurus, and Capricorn, and Mars is at 24 degrees right now, Uranus is at 23 degrees, and Pluto is at 28 degrees. So Pluto's is not quite as tight into this, but Mars is going to be applying this trine to Pluto. And then around the time when Mars perfects to Pluto, Neptune is at 27 degrees of Pisces. So Mars will be opposing Neptune at the same time it trines Pluto, and it's also trining Uranus, right? And then there are sextiles between Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus, right? But, that could be quite a lot of dynamics to try to get into in one video, so I'm thinking I'm going to focus more on the dynamic between Mars and Neptune. And, I have to also admit that Neptune has this kind of quality of being kind of this sort of like nebulous, watery, undifferentiated mass, and this is actually, maybe that's a good starting point, because one thing about Virgo, and specifically the quality of Virgo right now, is that Virgo is often associated with this quality of planning, because it's an earth sign, it's a sign of Mercury. Right now, Mercury is in Virgo. We're going to have a Mercury retrograde soon, and but Mercury has good dignity in Virgo, and Mercury kind of stands for, compared to Jupiter, which is more about big philosophical things or big theological things, Mercury is more about dealing with the fine details, and in Earth sign dealing with the rational, kind of grounded experience of life. And Mars has this quality of cutting, of severing, and I often think, this quality of like a surgeon or something like that, or a doctor, or the tensions between, let's say, allopathic medicine on one hand and more alternative forms of health or spirituality or something like that, as represented by Neptune. And I'll kind of get into that with it's like there's this kind of thing with Virgo and Mars and Mercury. There is this tendency to really want to sort of like have the spotlight kind of consciousness, to like zero in on specifically what the problem is, and then if you can isolate the problem, remove the problem. And then, but the problem with Neptune is, I was thinking, you ever heard that expression, one bad apple spoils the bunch, or whatever, right? That I think with Mars opposite Neptune, there is this kind of, Mars wants to zero in on specifically what the bad apple it is, and Mars is all about cutting and removing and separating and being able to find out what the problem is, isolate the problem, remove it, take it out. But the problem with Neptune, though, is that Neptune represents something that could be subject to contamination, right? That, like, if the apple has gone moldy and rotten, it could have already spoiled the bunch, and even if you take it out, it's like this kind of thing with, there's certain ideological things that you see this kind of dynamic come up in, and I think one of those things is like the criticism of, let's say, the police on one hand, right? Because people could say the problem with the police is just there are a few bad apples, but then you're like, no, wait a minute, there's actually maybe a systemic, endemic problem, and you can't just isolate certain individuals, you have to look at the whole system, right? And also, in my own personal experience, a couple of years ago, I had some health problems, and it was under this transit that I basically gave in and went to the hospital, right? And there were certain, I don't know, maybe I've already talked about this in another Mars Neptune video, but there's this kind of thing. I think there can be certain qualities like denial, right? Like if you're really sick and you're kind of in denial about how sick you are, then that could be a Neptune Mars quality, because Neptune specifically here represents kind of like an undifferentiated mass, or the failure to be able to differentiate between one thing and another. And I think even that archetype is useful for me to reflect on, because what I was hospitalized for was an autoimmune condition, which is basically like the body fighting itself. It's like, instead of the body fighting off a virus or a bacteria or some external organism, the body doesn't know what it's fighting, and it ends up fighting itself. And I think that's kind of indicative of the Mars opposite Neptune dynamic, is that you want to cut something out, you want to separate, you want to like isolate the problem, but then like, what if you were so immersed in that thing that you are the problem that you're trying to separate from, and it becomes this sort of like it could be self-destructive, or you could be, like biting the hand that feeds you, or it could be like, you could also be this kind of like, it's kind of pointless, because it's like this problem has basically metastasized, it's spread throughout the whole system, that you can't, Mars wants to isolate and remove, but what if it's just in the whole thing, right? And I've seen other astrologers talk about the Mars-Neptune dynamic in terms of like a crusade, right? And crusading being a kind of like ideological or purity, basically, right? And you see, whether or not you're you put the crusades in the past, you see purity politics come up all the time, where, if you have to have, specifically, you have to agree with everybody on each little thing, or else you're cast out and exiled or something. And I think like the whole cancel culture and all this could be, indicative maybe of Mars, Neptune, dynamics, or that urge to isolate and remove, and to try to keep something free from contamination, to keep something pure or something like that. And this very much goes with the archetype of Neptune being connected with the Garden of Eden, right? And that this whole thing about once Adam and Eve have the knowledge of good and evil, that what is previously undifferentiated becomes different. The knowledge of good and evil is essentially the sort of realization of differentiation, and all it takes is one initial difference, and then the whole creation just kind of spills out of that, right? And the fall from the Garden of Eden, and the fracturing into all sorts of multiplicity and stuff like that, right? Other things to consider about this sort of quality of ideological purity and puritanicalism is the issue around stuff like communism. And one of the interesting things is that if you look at the conjunctions of Saturn and Neptune that happened in the 20th century, you can track Saturn and Neptune conjunctions along with the pivotal moments in basically the Soviet Union and various communist states. And specifically, the obvious one, because it happened in my lifetime, was the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, which happened when there was a Saturn-Uranus-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn, right? And then, like, I don't have it all just by memory, but if you look at these other Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, you can see, earlier on, around the birth of the Soviet Union, that Neptune is there, right? And I think that one of the things to consider about Neptune in terms of communism is that communism is, criticize it all you want, but it is essentially an attempt to kind of, rather than just saying that this is how the world is to say that we have an ability to create something different, and there's a desire to create something that's maybe even, utopian or a way to get, we can create a society that doesn't have to be built on so much oppression and suffering and these kind of progressive ideals, this kind of dream to make the world a better place, regardless of whether you agree with communism or not. And I think what's interesting is that I have to admit that I come from a family that is very much left-wing socialist, and I was raised in the Unitarian Church, but I didn't have much exposure to Christianity, and as such, there's something about it where I've always been more kind of in line with left-wing socialist ideas, but it took me a while to really appreciate like how much of a conflict there is between communism and religious stuff, right? And that I think one of the tensions here was that the communists, of course, saw religion as being the opiate of the masses, basically just used to subdue people and make them docile, and that they attempt to basically throw out all the stuff about religion to try to reclaim the productive force of the worker and not have it hooked into these belief systems where you just suffer on earth and you're rewarded in heaven. Basically, they basically saw their project as being incompatible with religion, and so in a sense, if you with that in mind, I don't necessarily blame religious people for having this oppositional attitude towards communism, right? But in the way that there can be an intolerance with the religious people can be very intolerant towards the idea of communism. It could also work the other way around, where people who are progressive and people who are socialist could be very intolerant towards the idea of religion, right? And this is the kind of thing that when, it reminds me of stuff like I had a friend who was able to resolve this problem because he was involved in the Catholic worker movement or whatever. There was a movement of socialist Catholics. There's people like Dorothy Day. I don't know if Thomas Merton was somehow connected to this, but there's a certain progressive flavor of Christianity. And it's the kind of people who will often remind you that, if Jesus was around today, all this stuff about like hanging out with the lowest classes, like the prostitutes and the lepers and all this kind of stuff, like that would be a socialist thing to do, right? That like Jesus would be the ultimate socialist or whatever, right? And there's a common thread between each of these things, which is the archetype of the Redeemer, which I think goes very well with Neptune. And it's like this kind of thing of like the forgiving the lowest of the low kind of thing, right? Or to not if Jesus didn't go in there with the lepers with a hazmat suit on, you know what I mean? Like it's like he it's to and there's also obviously this sort of self-sacrificial thing with the whole archetype of Christ, and to this idea of grace as something that, like water, pools down to the lowest point, and there's a kind of an accepting of the masses, and the meek shall inherit the earth, and all this kind of stuff. This is maybe a bit of a ramble. I'm just kind of whatever. Like I said, this is a Neptune video, so the differentiated edges from one idea and another may kind of blur together here a little bit, but I think it all kind of goes with the basic problem of there's of this Neptune archetype, right? And I mean, okay, there are certain things that I have been kind of at odds with, which is like whether or not to include some of my own personal stuff in these videos that I do. And I wasn't really, I don't know. Yes, the last video that I made, I included some stuff about how I had a kind of social blunder with another astrologer, and that had kind of thrown me off my game in terms of feeling confident and about producing astrology content. And I think that I don't know. There's something about also about this whole thing about Mars and Neptune that it could be this aspect playing out, but I keep, I also mentioned in my last video how a friend came to visit and he was very encouraging of my astrology videos and my astrology work and encouraging me to keep going with it. But in spite of that, I still feel very much like I'm at a point where I'm questioning just making my personal life visible on the internet, or that, I mean, it's mainly this thing about like if I'm making work, I want to make the best work possible. If there's anything about why I would keep doing astrology videos, is because that I've been able to have a certain amount of experience doing like readings for people and following the transits and basically just relating to it as something that goes on in reality in life, that instead of trying to giving it all up and finding something new to do, it makes more sense for me to just sort of stay with it and keep developing it. But I think that there's something about Mars opposite Neptune where it can really start to, like, I don't know, this feeling like I want to give up, or I don't want to do it, or there's also this thing about Neptune which has to do with like forgiveness and compassion and all this kind of stuff, but it can be a difficult archetype for the human to really embody, because it's like this whole thing about like unconditional love and all this kind of stuff. It's like, I mean, unconditional love is great, but when it comes to actually dealing with real people and real relationships, it's not, that's not always how we do things, right? And in terms of, I don't know, I feel kind of bad about even mentioning it in my last video, but then I feel if I didn't mention it, I feel like I'd be dancing around it, right? But this whole thing about like, this we have this human, you have this sort of archetype that of to be compassionate to other people, to forgive people of their faults, right? And I think with Mars opposite Neptune, what does Mars stand for? It's the warrior, the sort of aggressive masculine force, the sort of self-assertive force. And then there's Neptune is something that may not agree, but can forgive somebody for their differences. Or that if Mars can also stand for something of just being, like, Mars is the malefic, right? So Mars can have this quality that can be repulsive, or like a bad pungent odor, or a bad smell, or something that you don't like, that you want to get rid, and Neptune is like the clean, the waters. It's taking like a bath to make yourself smell nice, and more, I think, and it kind of goes with this. Oftentimes people talk about Virgo as being cleanly. I don't know if that's a stereotype or not, but I feel like with Mars opposite Neptune, there's this sort of like tendency to want to sort of forgive and purify and wash away the sins and be like all is forgiven and stuff like that. But as human beings, I think we have a lot of difficulty with that, because it's sort of like or that we can create sort of containers, right? We can create certain vessels where we can say this is, in this space, it's a judgment-free zone where everybody's accepted, everybody's welcome, and we're here to listen and stuff like that. But creating that container creates a special zone where when you're outside of that, and if somebody expects to be treated with unlimited compassion and kindness, and I mean, you're like, I'm a human being, maybe I don't want to, give you, maybe it's not my job to give you unlimited love and compassion and forgive. Maybe maybe I'm human and I don't want to do that, right? Or that, like, the shadow of that, it's like this kind of undifferentiated thing where we're not going to differentiate between good and bad and right and wrong and I want and I don't want and I like and I don't like. We're just going to be universally accepting. But then that also suggests that the shadow of that is that, I'm a person. I do have preferences. There are things I like. There are things I don't like, and there are things that make me feel uncomfortable, or there are things that I would want to say no to, or there's things that I would not, that I'm not Jesus, that I'm not hanging out with the lepers, right? And I think it's like what Carl Jung talked about in terms of being seized by the archetype is that, like you don't, it's okay to say no. It's okay to realize you're not some universal force of holy compassion that has to accept everybody, that you have to be an unlimitedly kind to everybody, that part of, I think, Christianity is like, there's this whole thing about you imitate Christ and being Christ like the best you can, but ultimately, the whole thing about Jesus Christ died for our sins is that each human being doesn't have to be literally Jesus Christ, and making all your friends a bunch of lepers or something like that, right? But then there's this sort of like the polar opposite to that is like being like this kind of exclusionist thing. Like I'm going to be completely pure in the sense that I'm not going to let any of the dirty, unclean, evil people near me, and I'm just going to isolate myself in this pristine little bubble and push out the outside world and retreat into my own little inner fantasy life, and that anybody outside of that is treated with hostility, right? So I'm sort of illustrating these extremes. Like you could try, dive into the world with unlimited compassion, or you could retreat into your own inner world and then treat the outer world with hostility, right? And these are both different Mars kind of Neptune dynamics, right? And I think one of the part of the problems with the online world is that this whole thing about I also have to admit I am a complete hypocrite when it comes to this, because after making that other, like, I don't know, I read a lot of Byung Han, and probably even mentioning his name will probably take me down in the algorithms. Byung Han tries to warn you about this in his books. He calls it the Banopticon, that there are certain ideas that if you mention these ideas, that you will just become not very popular because the ideas are basically counter to the machine system of how things work, right? But one of these ideas is the exclusion of the other, right? About how when we retreat into this world where instead of a world of difference where there are people with different stuff going on that you feel compassion for, if instead you just retreat into your own world of basically an echo chamber, right, where everybody agrees with you, everybody shares your opinion, and you surround yourself with yes men or whatever that say you're right, and then it's like a narcissistic kind of bubble, and that I think it works really well with this Neptune Mars thing, because I think if anything, Neptune can kind of do with pain relief, right? Mars could do with pain or like an injury or a disease, and Neptune could be like the kind of thing that washes over that, right? That kind of dulls the nerves, that kind of lulls you into a kind of a pacified sleep or something like that. And Byung-Chul Han criticizes this. Like, he's got a book called The Palliative Society, right? And I have to admit, though, that even what I like about Byung-Chul Han is that he is not because his ideas are, like there's writers who are difficult in the sense that they may be difficult to understand. I think Byung-Chul Han is actually very easy to understand, but it's difficult because he gives you a hard pill to swallow, right? Or that it's like you can understand what he's saying, but to actually apply that in actual life seems difficult. And I'll give you one example is that, at some point in time, when I'm on Facebook, I often have this growing list of people who have the friend request list that I don't go through. And there was one point, it was kind of silly that I just decided, I don't know, I just decided to accept 100 friend requests all at once, and then have my Facebook junked out with all these, sketchy people that I probably should have filtered out, right? But like one of the people that I accepted was like an Ayn Rand kind of supporter, right? And it's one of these things where it's like if you're trying to like accept a friend on Facebook, do you look at this person and what they're into, and and look for red flags, like this person really likes Ayn Rand, and then be like, okay, that's a sign. I can see this association that this person likes something that I don't like, so that makes him somebody I should cancel out. That I will not accept this friend request, right? So I think I remember that like when I was like at some point in time, whenever I accepted this, I'm like, for the sake of like Byung Chul says, I will accept this guy's friend request, even if he does think differently than me, even if he is an Ayn Randian kind of guy. And then, but the point is, like, what happened? Like, a year went by. I don't know. This guy didn't get put in my algorithm at all. I didn't have any interaction with this guy. And then, eventually, I'm just in a bad mood, and I go on Facebook, and I had some Ayn Rand bullshit that's not even, like, it's not even, like, making a intelligent argument. It's just saying, like, well, Ayn Rand would be pissed if she took a look at the world around, or just say, like, there's some really offensive stuff, like saying that, like poor people in Africa, it's like it's their fault as individuals that if they're starving or if they have AIDS because they couldn't just get their Ayn Randian hustle together, right? There are actually people that think like this, and it's sort of like, what's the point of having these people? Like, I'm not going to talk to these people. I mean, what are we going to do? If I did talk about them, what do I do? Argue with them, and then you just delete each other anyways. So it's sort of like, what's the point? In some way, and there's this sort of idea that like the thing about having the friction of different people who think differently than you, or different people who, it's not just there to please your sensibilities, but it's sort of like, I think the point is to provoke some kind of a change, or to get you to do something differently, right? And so, I mean, if like maybe it could be more healthy to be like, okay, rather than just writing Ayn Rand off, maybe there's something about the kind of the power of individualism or whatever, or libertarianism, that I should try to consider the values of the other side and change my, but it's not going to happen by the level of discourse of these, but calling, I don't know, maybe it's not good to call people an idiot or whatever, right? But I don't know. I think this is kind of one of the things to watch out for with Mars Neptune. People often talk about addiction with Neptune as well, and I think it basically plays into this. Is that when you're addicted to something that is relieving the pain of life, it's basically like there's this whole kind of like the friction, the world you're in, and the circumstances that you are in are not just their pleasing circumstances, that there's some kind of thing you want things to be different, right? And to be empowered, to have agency, is to have the capacity to make the changes in your life to make your circumstance different, right? But if the whole thing about the idea of addiction is that if you are using drugs or alcohol or whatever other addictive coping mechanism, it's basically you're trying to escape your own nervous system. You're trying to escape these own pain signals and to just make things comfortable. And then in a state of being comfortable, there isn't such a pressure to change or make things different. But then the other thing though is that if you just approach the friction itself, the way things are set up is that we live in a very individualistic society where it becomes not about changing anything relational, but rather you have to change yourself. It's all about and then this, I have to admit, I've got all these. Carl Jung is right up in there with his whole thing about individuation, right? Is that rather than, dare I say the name of that certain Canadian Jungian guy that everybody knows so well, right? But that's what he's all about too, right? Is that rather than talking about the the world that we're in, it's all about self change, right? And then you have all this sort of like wellness culture kind of attitudes, but it basically is kind of, it becomes a kind of a, it becomes a situation where it's like a hustle culture thing, right? I don't know. And apparently, and this is the kind of audience, this is the kind of culture that I'm making videos for. And, I'm becoming more kind of, I think sometimes it can help to, rather than just try to like remove people off your social media or block people, sometimes it can help to sort of reflect on what it is that's so irritating about them. You know what I mean? Like, that's another big Carl Jung thing is that whatever irritates you about other people is ultimately trying to show you a lesson about yourself that you're uncomfortable with, right? And I'll give you, I won't name names here, but there's one person that I know, because I mentioned oftentimes my background in things like the spiritual emergence community and radical mental health, is that I find it really interesting to watch other people that approach things, similar issue in a different way, but like there's the whole climate around, like wellness culture or the spiritual entrepreneur hustle culture, and it's like this whole thing about like watching other people who are trying to make like positive affirmations or keeping it all about love and light, or trying to be a self-supporting individual who's working to change it, but it's like you can tell that people are obviously struggling with it, and that like beneath the veneer of like positivity and all that, like these people are actually probably very bitter and resentful, but you're like this, it's almost kind of like hilarious. I have to admit, it's unfair for me to laugh at other people because I might as well be laughing at myself, and I'm just failing in my own way with the same problem, right? But this whole thing about like, you're trying to, it's like you're trying to be like as positive and as like affirmative and about your own growth and transformation, but like the bitterness and the resentment is just kind of bubbling through the surface, and it just comes off as being like extremely passive aggressive, and it's like this kind of like things like like if you don't want to pay for my services, that just means you're at a low vibration. How about that one? Mic drop. And it's like, but it's like the point is like you're the one who's struggling. Like it's like somebody who's like you can't get your little spiritual entrepreneur business off the ground, but you want to be like positive, but you're like, well, I'm just gonna like make fun of all the people who aren't using my services and criticize and saying these people just can't step to my high vibration. It's like oh my god, it's such a like it's like a farce, right? But the thing, like, I don't know. What am I doing except for making, these astrology, like, at least I can say, I can not be so identified with that I can, like, step back from it and then, and look at it, right? But the whole, this is one of the things where I don't know if it even makes sense to make these videos or even to try to be an astrologer anymore. And that's like, I don't know, like, but it's like there's something about this idea of centering, though, anyways, where I can see that there's a certain thing out there in the world that is, a new age, they call the spiritual community that has certain ideas about the way you do things. And then there's other things that I like I'm really into like philosophy and critical theory and things like that. And oftentimes these things don't really mix well together, but there are areas where they do mix well, but there's certain points of tension. And I'm in a position right now where I find it interesting to to be there somewhere where I can say I'm not this thing and I'm not this thing, and what I am actually is beyond these simple categorizations. Like I am a sensitive new age guy, or I am a frustrated Nietzschean philosopher, or I'm a Zen, like I'm a white guy who wants to be a Zen master or something like that. Like all these things are, they may have some degree of relative truth to it, but if by this whole process of centering is that I can step back from any of these categorizations and realize that doesn't represent the whole. The truth of yourself is there's something ineffable about yourself, right? Yeah, and so, if I had to give up being an astrologer, if I had to give up my different things that I do, that doesn't mean that, it may be a part of myself which needs to die for a new thing to be born or something like that, but it's not like my whole sum total of my identity, right? But there's something about, yeah, it can sometimes feel a bit isolating though if all these different, you just relate to the world around you as all these different stuff which is you have some degree of problem with, right? And that's, I don't know, maybe this again is too much of a ramble, maybe this is another not very good video, but I am having a go at it anyways, and I could very well just stop doing this shit, I could just give up, right? But and maybe it would be better for me to do that. Who knows, right? But as is, I'm gonna keep going with it. I did an I Ching reading that this was actually encouraging to keep going. So I'm gonna do it, I think. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. Hopefully this isn't as terrible as my other videos. Okay.